Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Kevin Janes, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thank you, Kevin. On the Improvisers podcast, we talk with performers about their histories, their practices, their conceptualizations around their practices, their aspirations and their current projects. Who are we in conversation with today, Kevin?
Today, Neil, we've got the wonderful opportunity to chat with Robbie Avenaim. Robbie spoke of his passion for percussion, having been discovered playing on pots and pans as a child. He spoke of a wide and diverse range of musical influences right from childhood, and also spoke of explorations with vibrators.
Robbie talks of robots having been some of his best drum teachers, and he acknowledges the influences of the New York experimental sound scene in the 90s, and outlines his history of curation and creation of new music festivals in Australia, in particular the What Is Music Festival 1994 to 2012, and currently the Safe and Sound Festival. I hope you enjoy this enthralling conversation with Robbie Avenaim as much as we have.
Yes, let's go.
Hi, Robbie Avenaim, and welcome to the Improvisers podcast. Maybe we'll start today's conversation with the question, how did your interest in sound begin?
How did I begin my journey with sound? I think I started off. My parents told me I started off with pots and pans. I think, from memory, I do remember that, sitting in front of the television and enjoying that aspect of it. And kind of like, I guess that's kind of maybe the birth of me thinking maybe I like the drums. So I always had this memory sitting in front of the telly with my family and doing that sort of thing, to them watching, I don't know why, but I feel like they were watching some Frank Sinatra or something like that, but But eventually I sort of leaned towards playing the drums a lot, and then it became it was an obvious instrument that I was attracted to. Even though I came from a musical family. My uncle was an opera singer, a tenor, and my brother played guitar and wrote jingles and love songs, maybe way too many. And my dad played piano and any organ he could, any sort of Casio organ he had in the house or anything like that. But for him, it wasn't, I think the professionals, and I also had a heavy rock, metal sort of cousin who, was in the Australian rock scene for a very long time through the 70s. But so mixed influences, really. And they were always present. My parents used to listen to a lot of Arabic music in the house, and French music, and all sorts of Latin music. And they came from Alexandria in Egypt. So it was a very multicultural sort of period of time back then. They were born there in the 20s. And but a multicultural family background, diaspora around the world from there on, from the Ottoman Empire and everything else. So so there's always a mixed sort of influence musically, I think, in my family. It was put out there. I wouldn't say there was much jazz, if any. I mean, maybe just listening. My parents would listen to just your classics, your crooners and stuff like that. But I did get a taste of all sorts of music as I was getting older, and I was hearing those kinds of music. So I would be like, I've heard this somewhere before. I've heard Xavier Cougar. I've heard, Kulthum. I've heard Deep Purple. I've heard, Black Sabbath. I've heard, some jazz. I've heard some, so it eventually all just seeped in. So that was my kind of first experiences with sound, until I kind of got involved in a working group of friends at school, which we all seem to have similar influences, not similar influences, but similar tastes in music at the time, and then exposed each other to different kinds of musics, i.e., Jimi Hendrix to John Coltrane to more avant-garde, Cecil Taylor, other styles of music and contemporary, classical music and stuff. So that all just then sort of, I guess, gave me an impression of like, oh, these are your options here. If you want to pursue music, this is maybe an interesting thing to be kind of looking into. So that's kind of it.
Robbie, when you spoke of being exposed to a wide range of options, I'm really interested in let's call it the transition from, say, playing music to sound art, whatever that might mean. And it appears as though for many years now you've been sort of involved in the sound art world. And how would you differentiate that between sort of music world? Maybe it's a false differentiation that I'm talking about, but if we talk about the music scenes and sound art, tell us about what you perceive as a difference, or what drew you into that particular domain, and what keeps you alive and exploring there.
I would. That's sorry, I have to look back a little bit, in my head a little bit there. I feel like, and I think that it potentially was influenced by, once again, it was influenced by, I guess more traditional forms, because eventually I started getting into playing jazz and fusion, but only in the context of practicing at home mostly. Eventually I did get out into the community to try that out and mix with musicians. But by then I'd still, I'd say I was probably still a conventional artist, but I think I was, and this is through Oren and Bachi, and we went to school together, and we both influencing each other a lot with music, but listening to music, different kinds of music, and playing stuff at home and practicing. He used to play drums. He still plays drums, but his main instrument was drums. So we used to set up 2 drum kits in his house and at my place, at my parents' house, and we just, it was mostly our relationship was mostly a drummer's duet at the beginning of it. But it kind of, I guess, the amount of noise that you create out of playing 2 drum kits right next to each other, and then being kind of like, I guess at some point we kind of, I'm going to merge a couple ideas together, that I started hearing, I was introduced to some Japanese noise music. And I think at that point, everything just becomes like a completely different thing. It becomes texture, right? And so there's influences of that. And also I used to watch Oren, and he was quite good at it. He used to use tape decks in his house to create these little audio cassettes that we used to, just these crazy little audio cassettes of just fun stuff we used to do. But they used to have a combination of like, vocal silliness, some kind of like abstract cutaways from different albums of different people, to just noise in general, to, just stumbling across a junk in the bedroom, and just anything to just make these collages of pieces. We would kind of make these tapes. And I think those things started to kind of leave me with an impression of like, I didn't even know about music concrete. I didn't know about any of that stuff, but we were dabbling with that and enjoying the idea of like, hey, we can make our own little mixtapes of just, they were pretty Dadaist, if anything, not even knowing about that world, at all. But, I guess that world comes from some sort of innocence of exploration or of some kind or something. So from, doing it at a young age, we were probably like, I would say probably, probably 16, 17, around that time we were doing that. So, it wasn't until that I, eventually sort of, I guess, started hearing music like that and starting being introduced to more textual music. And that I think I definitely would have heard that music before. It's hard for me to pinpoint it, but the first time I ever heard it live, I think was through Jim Denley's Machine for Making Sense group, and watching those guys doing that sort of stuff and thinking, what are all the different elements in this band that make up this music, And so that was a really great influence for me, I think. And then listening to a lot of more modern classical, listening to Varese and listening to Xenakis and that stuff. And then you're starting to hear textual stuff. Then I started experimenting with like, oh, well, what if I put a Xenakis? Because I used to play along with a lot of records at home when I was a kid, drive my parents insane, because that was the only way to practice. I wanted to get the experience practicing jazz and different types of fusion and other musics. But my taste of getting a chance to play along with noise and texture and stuff like that, because I wasn't out in the scene yet, I was still too young, was like I'm talking like 18, 19 by then, was to put on a Xenakis record and play along with that, or put 2 Xenakis records on and play with that, or put 4 Xenakis records on and play along with that, So it was like, it was just heading towards, how do I play conventional drums with this? So I guess that had its, I guess there was a time period on that where it was before I would actually say, okay, how do I, and I was telling a friend of mine about this the other day, a great musician called James Rushford. I was saying to him that I remember putting on a Varese ionization record on, and for the first time, and thinking that was a drummer, and I really wanted to play drums like this. Yet I only had it on cassette. I didn't have it on drums, so I didn't know the orchestration or there was an ensemble. It didn't make sense to me that was an ensemble. I just thought, this is a nutcase drummer who's just had this incredible ability. So, but you kind of pick up on these textures, and I guess the textures is another element and another aspect of the vocabulary of playing music. And when I added that to my vocabulary, it obviously became like a pretty deep sort of well there at that point, and that I really wanted to explore. And so that was probably, that led me to, I guess, your question in terms of sound in general, in sound art.
Tell us about how that led you to New York and John Zorn.
Yeah, that was also, I mean, I'm giving Oren a big plug here, but we like, once again, influence each other a lot. But he was spending a lot of time in New York, in general, going there and studying. He was doing a lot of rabbinical studies at the time. But he was going to a lot of the downtown new music gigs. I was always in Australia, but we were talking via postcards and letters and stuff like that. And he was telling me, I saw this gig and I saw that gig and I saw Zorn and I saw this stuff and I saw this new music gig and blah blah. So we're always in touch about that stuff. But it wasn't until, actually, it was 94, because I remember we applied for a grant to an Australia Council, like formerly known Australia Council, now Creative Australia, but to study with Zorn. Oren had a connection with Zorn because, he used to go to the gigs. I think Zorn liked seeing a rabbinical student that knew so much about his career and his music and everything like that. So, there was a connection there already, but I had not yet been introduced to him. So it wasn't until we thought, hey, listen, there's this thing called a grant we can apply for a grant. Maybe we could both go and study with Zorn or do something, whatever. And Zorn was nice enough to write us a fax at the time, and he sent that across, and we were lucky we got the grant, you know, with the help of like I think a theatre director called Rodney Fisher helped us write the grant from Sydney, you know, a really great director. And so then we traveled there, you know, we had, I don't know, $10,000 or something between the two of us. We got a plane flight, went there, and had a good time, and met him and saw some gigs and whatever. But it was a bit later that we'd come back to New York after doing a tour with a band I used to play in with Oren and another artist called Nick Cambyses in Sydney, vocalist. And we were touring Japan, and Oren, it was Zorn's 40th retrospective at the time, and Oren said we're going to New York after. Anyway, you know, we want to go, and we were hoping to actually, we were going to go anyway to see the retrospective. We're actually hoping to get some sort of season pass, but there was no such thing. But Oren somehow got in touch with Zorn and said, listen, we're coming. And Zorn said, yeah, don't worry, I'll have you guys on the door anyway. But listen, what are you doing in Japan? And Oren said, oh, we're playing with Phlegm, doing a tour. And he said, fuck, I've got this section of my festival called Radical New Jewish Culture. Do you want to perhaps do a set, you know, where I'm basically just, you know, it's just like I think there was, I don't know, maybe a dozen different Jewish artists, you know, contemporary artists that he wanted to kind of, you know, feature in his festival. So, you know, Oren said, yeah, cool. And he asked me about it, and I was like totally stoked. So we went to New York. That was probably the album was recorded in 96. So it would have been between 96 and 97 that we went there. And then I got introduced to him, and then he said, oh, do you want to do some improv nights on the festival? And that way we got introduced to a whole bunch of really great artists that were playing on those bills, Fred Frith and Arto Lindsay. And you know, it was like we kind of, you know, welcomed into the family, the New York downtown music family. So that was big for us, you know. You know, at that point, Oren got to learn how to play Cobra and do a Cobra night, and you know, at that point we kind of just decided, like, okay, you know, I think we were in New York for ages, a couple months or something like that. Then it was like, okay, well, when we go back to Australia, it's going to be boring as bad shit. Do you think we should start a festival? You know, and do we know enough people that we could maybe do something similar like this? Because the whole vibe there was pretty amazing at his 40th retrospective. It was a whole month, 2 sets a night, every single day, a different band that he'd been associated with or a different part of his career. Every artist coming out from all over the world that's ever played with him. It was massive. And it was in a tiny little club called the Knitting Factory. And it was just a really nice family sort of driven community vibe. And I just went, oh, this would be so cool if this happened back in Australia. So we started getting our heads around it, went back to Sydney, and then kind of had this opportunity with a friend of ours that ran a club there, and just asked him if we could put on something once a week to start off with for maybe 4 weeks, which turned into 2 nights a week, and then turned into a whole week or 2 weeks. I think we did 2 weeks in Melbourne, in Sydney. And then the following year after that, which was like 96, 94, 95, 96, 97, sorry, we opened it up to Melbourne, and we did 2 weeks in Sydney and 2 weeks in Melbourne straight, and just found venues in Melbourne to do that in. So, yeah, I think Zorn was a pretty pivotal sort of like influence in that regards. Maybe not so much musically. You know, yes, when it came to the band Phlegm, that was influential, you know, and like bands like Mr. Bungle and those sort of like postmodern avant-garde rock sort of bands, you know, they were pretty influential to Phlegm, you know. But we, I think, always consider ourselves a little bit more delinquent and the way we played. So it was like that formula, but looking for also delinquent elements to throw into that picture to make it a little bit more punk and obscure and stuff, but with a similar discipline. You know, so yeah, he was pretty full. We're still in touch. I still contact him once in a while just to see if he's doing okay, and same back. And he's always been very kind and generous. So, you know, yeah.
Robbie, between 1994 and 2012, you mentioned that the festival What Is Music happened, and you're
Yes.
obviously both instrumental in it happening and continuing. Tell us a bit about that festival and what happened and how it evolved over that time and maybe why it ended.
It started in 94, and that was like briefly talking about it a second ago. You know, the idea was, how do we pull the community together to form a scene? It might have been put together in a selfish way, in a way, because we just wanted to be in it. We knew we were going to live in Australia, but at the time, it was like, you know, we really wanted to be involved in some sort of kind of like diverse community of artists, you know, and they existed. Those things exist. Those communities existed, but they were kind of, I saw them as being very separate entities. You know, the classical scene was separate, the jazz scene was separate, the avant-garde jazz scene was separate, the, you know, dance scene was separate, the rock scenes were all very scattered, the punk scenes, the metal scenes, you know, noise scenes were separate, industrial music was separate. It was all just really separate. They all knew each other, but I don't know how many people actually went to each other's gigs and how many people actually worked together. So the effort, the concept of the festival was like, can we make a really eclectic bill that you're going to have a mix, either a combination of artists playing together from different scenes, or we put those particular acts on the same night, so people we would actually sort of like demonstrate, you know, the how kind of diverse the community was to each other, but also open doors, just make it really, you know, like a bit more like, oh wow, I didn't realize, I didn't know about this music. Oh shit, I didn't know about this music, you know. But then get them to play together on the bills as well, and that's something we are kind of, I guess, over a period of time we started identifying who would be. It was heavily curated in that way. Who would be, what, you know, modern classical musician would be really great to play with that noise artist. Would they work together? Let's just try put them together and see what happens, you know, with their permission, of course, you know. But everyone was pretty welcoming to it, and I think that it was like something that everyone was kind of hungry for. And like I said, it wasn't something totally new. I think the only thing new that we did to it was we just kind of made it. It was just a really large event with a decent audience, and it became kind of fairly popular in that regard. So lots of people used to go, and they knew it was going to be fun. It got to the point where it went for a month in 3 cities, between 3 cities, and people had to start taking long service leave to see the whole thing, you know. So, which they were happy to do, nutcases out there. But it's kind of, I guess it kind of just, it might have helped just, you know, I guess get Australia a little bit on the map, because we started inviting overseas labels to come out and play, and exposing Australians to like whole scenes of Japanese noise, whole scenes of electronic music from Europe, or whole scenes of like obscure rock from America, and you know, it just exposed Australians to them. They took the word back to their countries and said, there's all this great shit that's happening in Australia. Put us on the map a little bit, and then just propel it a little bit. Just give it a little push, potentially. And even though we didn't really know what we were doing, and a lot of people were saying, you know, these guys actually have no idea what they're doing. They didn't say it in a way that they don't know what they're doing in terms of organizing stuff, but like what the outcomes are going to, how the benefits of the outcomes are going to be, you know. And looking back on those comments, I went, oh, okay, that was really nice that they said that, but I didn't really understand at the time what they meant. So it was really just an instinctive thing. I do also recall Oren having a conversation with Elliot Sharp, this was relayed to me that when Oren was talking about wanting to move to New York, and I had it on my mind as well at the time, you know, and be part of this scene, Elliot Sharp kind of said to Oren, you know, it sounds like you've got all this great stuff back home in Australia. It sounds like that needs to happen more there than it needs to happen here. So why don't you go back there and just create that, you know? So I think there were some influences from that as well. Just lots of people just talking in general, and it kind of made sense to do that. I think also we were young. We had our family back in Australia. I don't think any of us was ready to, you know, uproot and move to another country. And, you know, I do have regrets about it when I look back sometimes. But then, you know, all this history that happened here while I was here was really, well, I'm still here, but I think was really important. So that's how kind of Waters music evolved in a way to being what it was. Yeah.
I've got a question around your personal practice, Robbie. Manufacturing instruments to play has been a big part of your personal journey. How did that come about? Why did that come about? And tell us a bit about it.
Starts off as a fairly I did an exhibition in Melbourne called Motogenic. And when I was doing that, it was like a few of my installations that I've made, some kinetic, some robotic stuff. It was mostly all the kinetic stuff, but actually, I don't remember having any of the robotic stuff in there. Yeah, but or did I? Anyway, it's been a while. But I did want to kind of paint a picture of where all that stuff started, and when I had a spare room in the exhibition, I thought, oh, I'll put a plinth and I'll put some of my older instruments in there. I ended up realizing that the oldest instrument I had was a vibrator. All right. And it was a broken piece of, you know, vibrator that I had. It's completely smashed and mangled. But what I used to do with it was, you know, just put the vibrator on the drum skin on a drum kit and just let it bounce around and see what it was doing. And then I kind of play along with it a little bit. So it was kind of like an introduction to the vocabulary that a mechanical object left on a surface or terrain of some kind, what it could potentially create. And then, you know, then the idea of just like doing several of them, putting them on different drums, creating textures out of those. And then I started cracking. I thought, you know what, it's getting a bit expensive buying these things. And besides that, every time I go into a porn store to buy something like that, you know, the arguments I was having with people to try and open up the packaging so I could test it out on the counter was like, became ridiculous. They were like, listen, are you going to buy this thing or not? And I'm like, no, I just need to hear what it's doing. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, and I'm going, no, I use it as percussion. And they're like, yeah, bullshit. Just, are you going to buy it or not? You know? But I pretty much just decided I've got to crack these things open. I've got to look inside them and see what they're doing, you know? And then I realized, okay, you've got a motor, you've got a counterbalance, the massage machines, okay, they're a little bit different, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, the cracking technology open a little bit. It's very primitive mechanical technology, but simple, you know, but you know, that kind of led to me being a little bit, the curiosity behind what can I do with these, and should I start building my own? So yeah, I started buying motors and putting counterbalances on them myself, attaching them to chopsticks, attaching them to drumsticks, attaching them to all sorts of different things. And that basically, that lineage went for almost, 20 years of just seeing what I could do with, the concept of a motor and a stick combined, which later led to getting a grant from Australia Council at the time to build a a robotic device that I had in mind, even more sophisticated device there. So I got the grant. I got an engineer called Richie Allen, and at the time Robin Fox was dabbling with Max Patches. So he was nice enough to say, "Hey, listen, I'll help you pull up some software for this." So that was the first version, prototype of the SARPS system that I have, the robotic percussion system. But later in the back of my head, I was like, this is cool. That evolved into something completely different now. Now it's like it's a full-fledged, robotic system that I play along with on the drums, live and stuff, with multiple bass drums and whatnot. But yeah, it kind of led me to later down the line to think I want to revisit the earlier stuff, which was more kinetic. And there was artists like Ernie Althoff who were in Melbourne who build, wonderful sculptures and compositions using kinetic things. I was also at the time really, I was just interested in just like how far I could go with this. So I started connecting those. At the time, they were just little drumsticks, like like cooking chopsticks, with motors at the back that I could hold, and then just hold them against a cymbal or a drum and just play really fast sonic things. But there was an exhibition that I did where I went, oh, okay, I could hang these things as well and just let them bounce around and see what they were going to do then, So that was another little moment of like, oh wow, okay, flash, news flash, okay, alarm bells, okay, I put percussion in its, on the floor, and then I can hang these things. It'll jump around, and then watching it jump around and started hitting different things. I think at the time I was only operating in a 180 sort of area. I had two goalposts like this, and then the stick was in the middle, kind of jumping between the two and hitting things around it like that. But at some point I thought, oh, I wonder if I can get it to go 360. Then I had to add some other little bits to it so the circuitry wouldn't get tangled, and a thing called a slip ring. And then, I started making the first version of prototype of a 360 jumping stick that then I could put percussion right around it in a big circle. But I thought I need a bigger stick. So I started using fishing rods or things like that, or long pieces of bamboo, and refining the length of it and working that out. But then that became an instrument in itself, So all these things they were installations, but they were extensions, like another extension of when we were talking about texture before and sound art. For me, it was like, this is another educational leap in the idea, the mythology of an ideology of how a percussionist could play. The way the machines were rattling on the drums, the language that had, the language that the jumping stick had in the 180 degree area, or in a 360 degree with the percussion I was putting around it, the way that it was bouncing around, hitting things. It was kind of like I said this a long time ago, but they were some of my best drum teachers, because they really showed me what you could actually do, some of the robotic stuff, how fast it could play, what it was doing when it was hitting something, with some of the software or some of the kinetic stuff, or what it was doing. Later, that became even more complex because I wanted it to bounce around. It was only bouncing around in a 360, and I wanted to bounce around a whole space, like a big square room. And I couldn't work out, apart from maybe putting several 360, devices around the room, without, that was the only way that I could disperse the sound in a space. But it occurred to me at one point, and I always really used to like Alexander Calder. And I thought to myself, at some point, I read some stuff about him dabbling with motors and his mobiles, but he didn't ever describe what he was doing with those motors ever. So for me, it made sense. Oh, I wonder if he was using a similar sort of thing but then I thought that's ridiculous. He wasn't thinking of it in a percussive way, but it made sense. What if I attached some of those jumping sticks to a mobile and then see what the mobile will do? It kind of made sense. The mobile, as we all know, they move in a really beautiful sort of like, and quite a big area, depending on how big the mobile is. It can take up a whole space, in its balancing, sort of routine. So I started off with one. I had like a workshop. Someone offered me like a time and a space, and I just built a mobile with, one of the jumping sticks on, and I just watched it move around, just as an experiment. I thought, wow, it's actually covering so much area. It's constantly spinning in a 360-degree thing, but it's kind of moving around a whole space, and going anywhere you want. And then it clicked with me again. Okay, now I can put percussion all over a space and just watch this stick kind of like just slowly navigate wherever it decided to go, which was really beautiful. And then I added 2 sticks, 4 sticks, I tried all sorts of different variations of it. But, looking back on that, it was like, these are just extensions of my rhythmical sort of like, the way that I'm starting to, it started basically, there were the building blocks for how I was going to play when I just held drumsticks, really, So now when I play without those devices, I think I'm a mimic of those things in many ways. And of course, the whole history of me learning how to play drums and play, avant-garde music, but the influences that those machines had, which is really weird because like, we talk about, the influence of machines in, everyday life. But as a percussionist, I have to say it was unbelievably influential, like the language I have, the connection I have with those kinetic instruments and some of the robotic instruments. It's kind of like, I think I always wanted to be able to, I heard things, I couldn't play them, but I needed their help to play them. But they couldn't also play things that I could play. So I think the combination of the two was like quite a nice ensemble in that way, which is kind of where it's led me now. It's like I don't work with percussion ensembles. I work with these devices and me together, and together we, hopefully when you listen to the music, it kind of sounds like, an interesting piece of percussion, which maybe takes me back to when I was listening to the Varese records and going, how do I play like that? In a way, you know what I mean?
Robbie, say a little bit more now about where you're at now. Like you've just been talking about it, I guess, more generally. And such a simple question. What is improvisation? I'm wondering what for you, what is improvisation now? Looking back at your history, looking at the sort of interface between these remarkable sort of kinetic devices, robotic devices, and your own playing. What is improvisation for you?
I was having this conversation with saxophone player yesterday called Tim O'Dwyer, but he was talking about some of his students. But it was like, to me, and I think we both agree with this, that I think it's a really easy language to learn. The tricky part is when you start having conversations with people with it, when you're playing music, that is, with other improvisers playing with improvisers, that's when it can get really complicated, and it's quite a deep dive at that point. But to learn it, it's really, I think it's probably one of the simplest and the most sort of practical and most important art forms in music, or, genres in music, whatever you want to call it, to learn, because you really need those skills to play any kind of music. There is no music that doesn't have improvisation in it. So you really need those skills. The question is how much of a deep dive does anyone make with it? A lot of, artists feel like, they only need to go so far with it. But yeah, I don't know. To answer your question, I just think it's just another aspect of the language of music.
When you say improvisational skills are easy to learn, say a bit more about that. How is that so? Yeah.
Well, I've discovered it a little bit more maybe in the last 7, 8 years, where I've been working with people with disabilities and watching them, and the idea that I had that, like, well, and this is not to dish on music, traditional music therapy, but I thought at the time, oh look, what if we can introduce some of the experimental music to, like, families, that have have someone in their family with a disability. How do we introduce music to them? I mean, now we're opening up a new bag here. We're opening up a whole bag of, like, things heading towards the new project that I've been doing at the moment, a new pivot in my career, which is safe and sound. But I think I think it's a very easy thing to be able to introduce to people at a very young age, to develop a skill that later, if you want to play any kind of music, you'll at least have those functional skills to be, like, feel. There's a lot of people you meet out there, they go, oh, I really want to do something, but I feel uncomfortable. Like, oh, why don't you go and jam? Why don't you go jam with this person? Why don't we have a jam? They're like, oh, I don't know what to do. They've been playing music for ages, but they're like, oh, like, they freak out. So they've been not that confident when it comes to, like, improvising. And I think sounds to me like it needs to be introduced at a very young age, or it should be just taught anywhere, really. The question is, what kind of improvisation, at how stripped back of an idea are they actually going to teach that? Are they going to teach it superficially, or are they going to teach it, let's take a really deep dive into this, and then start with, we were talking about texture before, if we went and did, like, a course at the conservatorium or somewhere, or if at school, you're studying at school, and then one of the subjects of school is improvisation in music classes, and they're teaching kids how to improvise with just junk that is, found junk. Let's go out and let's find stuff out in the playground, and let's bring it all back, and let's try and make some instruments, and let's do this, let's do that. I think that would be a really great thing to have in the curriculum. And you'd find that musicians would just be, at least they might not go into that area, but even if they became, like, fantastic, classical violinists, they'd still be or pop artists or whatever, they would still be, like, very open-minded to the concept, so. But that's why I just think it's really easy. But if for some reason it's just considered being a little bit too complicated, unknown, abstract, will the parents freak out if we're teaching this sort of stuff at school? Too open, free thinking. I'm not too sure why.
Maybe you could just tell us where you're up to right this very moment, and what's opening up for you, besides the Safe and Sound, which is an ongoing festival. I'm thinking that's happening again.
Yeah, well, Safe and Sound is a festival, but it started off as a project that I wanted to do, that and this just came out of just, like, having the opportunity to work with to go to a friend of mine's brother's house, who his daughter has a neurological disease called leukodystrophy, different to, like, MS, but they're not similar, but they're kind of similar only because they affect the nerves in that regards, and and then eventually make it very difficult for someone to kind of move, and then there's other associated complications that go with that. But I was it was very kind that they said, why don't you come and just play, and her name was Jessica. Come and play for Jessica and play some music and do your thing. And I did that, and the brother, her father loved it so much, he said, come back again. And then we started seeing that her brother just said, her father said to me, listen, this is really great. I don't know what this music is that you're playing, but it's really cool, and it really distracts her, and she really likes it. You should do this more often. And he helped me. He works in disability care, and he said, why don't you set something up and do your thing? And then I applied for a grant. I got lucky. I got something out of Creative Australia again for that. And then it turned into a larger project, and it occurred to me, oh, wow, experimental music really, and the artists that are involved in that scene are really well suited to working in the disability sector. Not as carers, but they could, maybe we could forge a new type of communication with the families, the carers, whether someone's bedbound or chairbound or someone who's able-bodied or not that has a disability. But it just opened all these doors for me to like introduce what I thought was a really great music art form. And because it experimented, you could work with people with disabilities and really fine tune what they might want to hear. Because, like in Jessica's case, she can't speak. She can make sound out of her mouth. She spends all the time in bed, but she can't move her body, but her hearing is completely acute, So she spends all her days listening. So what perfect art form, but to be able to take something and then work with Jessica to kind of work out what the sounds she likes and how playful can we get her. There were very close interactions around her, around her head. And Jim Denley was like moving. I got Jim Denley a lot to come in, do stuff. Carolyn Connors came in once. This is all in Sydney. But as it branched out, it was like, well, I'm just going to use the whole new music communities, or as many as possible, and introduce them to this, which then became like another, sort of, being like, oh, wow, this is a whole new audience for the experimental music community. So if we went into people's homes and did concerts of experimental music, it's a great gig for those artists, those seasoned artists. B, fantastic for the family, build a new form of communication, hopefully, but introduce, you were talking about improvisation and like, how easy it is or isn't it is for people to learn. But within 5 or 10 minutes, I was teaching the families or the carers how to make sound, which I don't think you could do in conventional music therapy. I don't think you could tell someone how to play chords on piano or teach them how to play a song, but you can teach them how to make sound on a teacup or scrape some sandpaper together and do this and do that and do some, vocal stuff and whatever. And I used to do something really sneaky, like show them how to do something and then say, I've got to go to the toilet and actually disappear for like 10 minutes and give them the opportunity to like do stuff together. And then I'd come back and they'd be laughing their heads off and playing great sound art, and it's not deep improvisation, but it shows you that it's a really flexible and easy kind of like idea of like introducing sound into, using sound in the disability sector to, once again, a lot of fun but also a very deep way of kind of like discovering new things and about music. And that's why I started the festival. But when if I mentor some of these, I ended up mentoring some of these, some of the people involved in the project, going to people's homes, for example, and then the family saying to me, look, my son or my daughter or this person showing interest, they want to play live. And I know you play live. Wouldn't it be great one day if they could play live or play with you live or something like that? And then I was like, got to start a festival. And that, introduces, not only artists that are in the disability sector that are already currently practitioners, but people that are new to the whole experience to have an opportunity, like some sort of platform to play at outside of like working at their homes for years at a time, just playing music with interactive instruments or whatever it is, but to actually take them and go, well, listen, this stuff that we're doing at your place, why don't we do it on a gig at the festival that I'm playing at? I'll feature you guys, So the festival is kind of like, the home program is still happening, but the festival is like this thing where I'd really like to explore a lot more, because I think potentially it could become a whole new music scene.
Robbie, we're going to need to draw this to an end soon.
No problem. Yeah, no problem.
Neil and I had the opportunity to go to Safe and Sound at the Northcote, the last sort of event, and it was remarkable. It was truly remarkable to be present to a couple of days of that. So what a wonderful venture and adventure and generative prospect that is. So thank you so much for this morning to sort of open the doors to your world and to the prospects.
No, thank you so much. And just to let everyone know that we're doing the festival again this year. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
To speak, yeah.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
No problem.
Wonderful.
See you.
See you guys.
See you.